High in the Elkhorn Mountains of central Montana, about an hour south of Helena and tucked behind the small town of Boulder, is one of the state's most visited ghost towns. The town is so popular, in fact, that the population has actually begun to regrow up from zero about 30 years ago to about a dozen now. It was one of the most cosmopolitan, civil, and refined mining boom towns in the territory, though it did have a fair share of excitement. Let's dive into the history of the ghost town of Elkhorn, Montana. Silver was the draw that led hundreds of thousands to the northern Rockies of the United States in the 1800s. The mountains were rich with it, and the price of silver was skyrocketing as the U.S. government was buying large quantities of silver per month to back up its currency and subsidizing the value of silver along the way. A Swiss-American named Peter Weiss was prospecting in the Elkhorn Mountains and struck a rich vein in 1870. He staked his claim and went to work. Peter, however, was aged and reclusive, and didn't have the resources nor the strength to truly expand his claim, and died 2 years later. Now, Peter's death is something of a mystery. He seems to have been poisoned by a prospecting partner of his, a man named Simmons. Peter died suddenly and without warning, and when witnesses went to spread the word, they found that Simmons somehow already knew of his death and had already claimed all of Peter's valuables. Peter was buried in a hasty grave dug by Simmons within the town limits. After his death, the claim was purchased by a Norwegian man named Anton Holter, who immediately plotted a small town around his claim and named it Elkhorn after the mountain range that sheltered it. Come 1875, the mine was finally developed, with Holter first calling it the Holter Mine, and at the same time the town began to take shape. The real boom came in 1878, when the Bland-Allison Act was passed, increasing the government's monthly demand for silver. The mine dove hundreds of feet beneath the ground, yielding $30,000 in silver per month in 1870s money. Today, that's nearly $900,000. Elkhorn's first school was built on Main Street before the decade was out, and is one of the oldest buildings still standing on the site. The Elkhorn Hotel was built around the same time on the corner of South Street and Main, pretty much the exact spot where I parked my rental car when visiting Elkhorn. This was torn down around 1895, during the town's heyday, to make way for more modern buildings at the time. Elkhorn was producing not only silver, but also had a bustling gold, lead, and lumber industry. What made Elkhorn unique among the mining towns, however, was just how many of the miners brought in their rather large families, which created a whole domestic community and raised the standards for how the town behaved. The town's export of silver, gold, lumber, and lead, and the demand for fine imports for the families of the miners, led the Northern Pacific Railroad to build the town its own branch line. As the railroad neared the town in 1889, the population swelled with railroad workers and their families, in addition to the miners. Completing the railroad was no easy feat. It took 22 miles of track to connect Elkhorn to the rest of the railroad, and the track had to climb a 4% grade, up to 6,670 feet in elevation, the highest on the entire Northern Pacific Railway. When the railroad was completed, the town's population of 2,500 peaked. With the mine now nearing the 1,000-foot depth mark, the silver quality being turned out began to decline, and the mining rights were sold to British interests. That year, a darkness fell on the town of Elkhorn. The town's cemetery rests high in the hills above the town and tells the story of the tragedy of 1889. Diphtheria had been lingering among the town since 1884, but it spread to the children through the school in the spring of 1889, running rampant for the rest of the year. Schooling was temporarily suspended, but it did little to slow the spread of the disease. It was said that in 1 week, 7 people from the same family were buried. First the 6 children, and then their mother. So many headstones in the town's cemetery read off a child's name, died 1889. Another lesser-known tragedy is marked in the Elkhorn Cemetery. This is the grave of Harry Walton, aged 8. He wasn't a victim of the diphtheria epidemic, but of a mishap that struck Elkhorn while the town was already in mourning over the outbreak. Harry and his older friend Albin Nelson were exploring the hills a mile to the south of Elkhorn when they found discarded explosives. We'll never know exactly what happened, but the explosives went off, killing the two boys instantly. Albin was 12 years old, and he shares a grave with his friend Harry. The 1880s in Elkhorn ended on a sad note and a decline in population, both from diphtheria and the sale of the mine, but the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 increased the federal demand for silver once more, and resources were poured into Elkhorn. The mine boomed once more, but the population of Elkhorn had grown to be a warm, tight-knit community of only about 600 residents, down from the 2,500 a few years prior. For those who stayed, the quality of life would significantly improve in town. The town had its own brass band, there was horse racing, and there were baseball games, traveling shows, and boxing matches. If you can think of it, Elkhorn had it. If you walked up Main Street in 1893, you'd see every indication that Elkhorn was a thriving, family-friendly community, and that residents of the town could afford the occasional luxury. At the first bend to the southwest were female boarding houses, which still partly stand today. Passing one of the town's 3 functional schools and 2 of the blacksmiths, we'd first come to the Elkhorn Trading Company, a popular equipment and general goods store. Next to that, the 2-lane bowling alley, now long gone. Next came Hoffman's Barber Shop, the only place in town that someone could take a bath during the entirety of the 1880s. And of course this cabin is built on the site, and is not the actual barber shop. We can actually see exactly what this building looked like because in 1941 it was moved, furniture and all, to Nevada City, Montana, where it is still preserved today. Next to that was Ford's Candy and Confectionery Shop, no doubt popular among the children, and then a jewelry shop, popular among the ladies, and finally, Henry J. Schreiner's General Store. Crossing over a small alleyway, we come to the Metropolitan Hotel, a classy accommodation for visitors to Elkhorn. It was made up of 2 buildings. One was the hotel's office and restaurant, and the other building was the hotel rooms. Good number of door frames that have collapsed, fallen on their side but still maintain their shape. Behind me is the Metropolitan Hotel. Now there were many hotels in Elkhorn, but this one was the last one standing. It could sleep about 30 to 40 people at a time in its various rooms, and there's a historical map over there, a little information board that talks about all the different sites, and it lists this as still standing, which means this is unfortunately a very recent collapse. Up the road from the Metropolitan Hotel, there's a collapsed building there with very little info on it. But then there's another here and another there. This would have been a saloon right here. The old saloon over my right shoulder and the doctor's office over my left shoulder are also listed on the info board as still standing, which means these are also very recent collapses. I don't know how old that info board is. It could be as old as the 90s. So these could have collapsed any time within the last maybe 20-some years. While the population was slowly declining, the feeling of community was growing. Directly across the street from the candy shop, jeweler, and barber stood Gillian Hall, still standing today. This is the lower floor of the Gillian Hall, one of the 2 more iconic buildings here in Elkhorn. This first floor would have been a saloon or a store, but most likely a saloon. And the second floor above us was a dance hall. They did a lot of redecorating. So that's the oldest style here. to the newest. And it's not particularly new. It's just the most recent. This likely would have been a trap door down to the cellar. Now, interestingly, you'll notice there's no stairwell on the inside of the building going upstairs. It would have been a separate business, possibly by the same owner, but a completely different facility. Access to the second floor was in a stairway on the outside. So you can imagine if this was a saloon, being in here late at night, having your drink, getting a meal, with music playing and hear it muffled through the ceiling and the feet dancing on the floor. I'm sure that would have been wonderful. Unfortunately, there's no way for us to get up to the second floor. The stairwell outside is completely gone, but you can see the remains of where it once was. Gillian Hall fulfilled the town's needs for a while, until it was decided that a larger hall would be needed as a general meeting hall. Immediately next to Gillian Hall, to the west, was a private dwelling which was bought out in 1893, and a new 2-story town meeting building was built in its place. This would be called Fraternity Hall, as the town's many lodges and fraternities would share the meeting hall on the second floor. Inside these wooden walls, no doubt local lumber, groups like the Freemasons, the Knights of Pythias, and the Odd Fellows all met in secrecy. The forward portion of the upper floor was a maze of rooms, closets, and alcoves, and both floors featured what looks like a small window for a ticketing agent. Out there, a door to the deck. The first floor had a stage used for concerts, for theater, and all other presentation purposes, including the town's school graduation ceremonies. There would have been a door here with a glass window above. In fact, there would have been doors on all of these door frames. These were not open walkways, and we would have had 2 large doors side by side in that opening. Interesting shelf up there. You can see quite plainly the burn marks wherever they had a light on the ceiling. Fraternity Hall opened on July 4th, 1893, with the Elkhorn Brass Band playing the ceremony. Fraternity Hall became the heart of the community, and Gillian Hall next door fell vacant. Life was good in Elkhorn, but later that same year, the price of silver crashed with the repeal of the Silver Purchase Act, and the mines began downsizing, with the Elkhorn mine closing in 1900. By this time, 8,902,000 ounces of silver, 8,500 ounces of gold, and 4 million pounds of lead had been mined. Other, smaller mines were active and kept some of the townsfolk employed, but a devastating fire broke out in 1912 and swept much of the Main Street business district. The jewelry shop, candy shop, and several other buildings were destroyed, including the town's only church. The town didn't have the strength to recover from this fire, so the mines shut down for a few years, and most of the remaining population cleared out. At its height, the Northern Pacific Railroad had 3 trains a week coming into Elkhorn, but as the town declined, rail service was terminated around 1914. One resident said that when the train whistle was finally stilled, the end of an era was at hand. The tracks and most of the depot buildings were torn up in 1931, with the Northern Pacific leaving behind their 48,000-gallon water tower. This would have been demolished too, but the town was actually using it as their primary water source. As a result, the tower would eventually become the oldest Northern Pacific water tower still standing in the region. In the 2010s, at a cost of $30,000, the tower was restored by preservationists and rail historians. Another railroad-related site to the west of the town, further out of the canyon, is this mill site. The railroad bed is still visible, which would run along the upper portion of this mill, dump ore, and it would be processed here. It even looks like this wooden section widens for a switch, so that a locomotive coming up here could either go off that way or come into the mill to dump ore. post office closed in 1924, and the town was not even counted on the 1930 census. By then, Elkhorn was all but abandoned. The Elkhorn Cemetery doesn't only mark the tragedies of 1899, but is also the resting place for the people who experienced their happiest memories and spent most of their lives in this town. Fred Bell was born in Musquodoboit, Nova Scotia, Canada in 1856 and moved to Elkhorn in 1886 in the town's early days. He met a lady named Frances here, and they wed in 1896. Had kids, they grew up here, and even as the town declined, Mr. and Mrs. Bell refused to leave. Frances died in 1911, taking her place in the Elkhorn Cemetery. Fred was one of the last full-time residents of Elkhorn, and he died in 1938 in the home of his son in nearby Boulder. His services were held in Fraternity Hall in Elkhorn before the procession carried him up the South Hills to the graveyard. Fred is buried with Frances, overlooking the once thriving town where they once made a family. There is a stone in the graveyard for Peter Weiss, the town's founder, but this is not where his body is. The body is actually likely buried beneath the floorboards of one of the homes along Elkhorn's main street, buried there by his partner, Mr. Simmons. The mine is littered with tailing piles, mixed with broken timbers and bent metal. The mill site has been dismantled, but it's still an imposing view. We're up towards the mine at the back corner of the town. Good number of collapsed buildings up here. So many buildings, all collapsed. Evans and Howe something, St. Louis. This building was once a private residence, likely owned by one of the town's butchers, as it's built on the back of the lot of land that once housed a meat shop. It was built sometime before 1892. No, I'm shaking the house. Across 2nd Street, an alleyway behind the two main halls and behind the butcher's house as well, is this interesting collapsed log cabin. It was built before 1892 and is purported to have an inaccessible cellar. As the years passed, Fraternity and Gillian Halls fell into disrepair, as these photos from the 1960s show. But somehow they remained standing against the harsh elements, They were preserved as Montana's smallest state park in 1980 and are still protected. The state has been working to restore these buildings and preserve them, and they are open to visitors. In 2001, the grandson of one of the early Elkhorn residents moved back into Elkhorn full-time, restoring his family's cabin and guarding the place from any ill-intentioned visitors. In the time since, other residents have also moved in, some full-time, some seasonally. This dog, who was happy to see us and welcomed us to his neighborhood.
Hello, I know, hi. Yeah. Alright, nice meeting you.
Today, Elkhorn has a population of about a dozen. You'll notice many of the old buildings are lived in as private residences, but signs hang on them so that you know what their early uses were. Elkhorn is not a difficult ghost town to visit. It's about a half-hour drive along maintained roads from the nearby town of Boulder, mostly following the old Northern Pacific Railroad into Elkhorn. If you do visit Elkhorn, please be respectful to the history of the site, the remains that still stand, and the current residents of the town. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Trent Greger, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Zolt Bognar, Colt Tannick, Sophie Baber, Exotic Exploring, Jakob Martin Hensen, Stephen Schwankertz, Rob, Oliver Chin Chen, Jahala, and John Miluski.